Hey guys, tonight we begin with something calm, something ancient, something quietly ambitious. So go ahead, dim the lights a little, maybe get comfortable, and let your brain slowly drift back a couple thousand years to a time when empires were built not with spreadsheets and emails, but with elephants, whispers, and very intense eye contact. We're heading into ancient India, a place of sprawling kingdoms, slow-moving rivers, and rulers who occasionally made very questionable life choices. And at the center of it all, we find a few individuals who somehow managed to rise above the chaos, or in some cases, become the chaos in a slightly more organized form. Tonight, we start with a man who didn't exactly come from luxury. No golden cradle, no palace lullabies. Just raw ambition and a very determined mentor who probably looked at him once and thought, yes, this one will overthrow a dynasty. So, let's gently wander into the life of Chandragupta Maurya. He wasn't born into obvious greatness. In fact, his early life is a bit unclear. Historians sort of piece it together like a half-finished puzzle. Some say he came from a humble background. Others suggest he had some minor royal connection. Either way, he was definitely not sitting comfortably at the top of society, which makes what happens next a little bold. At some point, he crosses paths with a man named Chanakya. Now, Chanakya is one of those figures who feels like he walked straight out of a very serious strategy manual. A scholar, a teacher, a political thinker, and most importantly, someone who held grudges with impressive commitment. Legend has it that Chanakya was insulted by the ruling Nanda dynasty. And instead of, moving on with his life, he decided to bring the entire empire down, as one does. So, he finds Chandragupta, young, capable, probably a little confused, and essentially says, "How would you feel about taking over northern India?" And Chandragupta, to his credit, doesn't laugh. He doesn't say, "That sounds unrealistic." He just goes along with it. Because why not? What follows is not a quick success story. It's a slow, patient climb. A lot of planning, a lot of careful movement, and probably a fair amount of trial and error. Empires, as it turns out, are not particularly easy to steal. But eventually, Chandragupta manages it. He overthrows the Nanda dynasty and establishes the Maurya Empire around 322 BCE. Just like that, well, not exactly just like that, but in historical terms, it's pretty quick. And suddenly, the guy who may have started with very little is now ruling one of the largest empires in Indian history. Not bad. Now, let's slow things down for a moment and just imagine the shift. One day you're navigating uncertainty. The next, you're in charge of vast territories, countless people, and an administrative system that definitely does not run itself. Chandragupta doesn't panic, though. He builds. He organizes. He creates a structured government. With help from Chanakya, of course, who is probably still quietly enjoying the downfall of his enemies. The empire becomes highly centralized. There are officials for everything. Agriculture,
Trade,
tax collection,
even espionage.
yes, spies. Because nothing says stable government like a well-maintained network of people reporting on each other. And honestly, it works. The Maurya Empire becomes strong, efficient, and a little intimidating, which, for an empire, is kind of the goal. Now, somewhere along the way, Chandragupta also encounters the Greek world, specifically, the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. Because even after Alexander's death, his influence was still lingering. Chandragupta ends up dealing with Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's successors. And instead of endless war, they reach an agreement. Territory is exchanged. Alliances are formed. There might have even been a marriage alliance in there because royal diplomacy often leaned heavily on, let's make this official with a wedding. It's all very practical, very calm, very let's not fight if we don't have to, which is refreshing. As the years go by, Chandragupta's rule stabilizes. The empire grows comfortable in its structure, and he slowly steps back. Now here's where things get a little introspective. According to some traditions, Chandragupta eventually gives up his throne, just hands it over, leaves the whole empire thing behind, and becomes a Jain monk.
Yes.
From emperor to ascetic. It's quite the lifestyle change. He reportedly spends his final years in quiet meditation and spiritual practice, possibly even undertaking the Jain ritual of fasting unto death, which is not exactly a light hobby, but there's something oddly peaceful about it. After all the ambition, all the planning, all the control, he just walks away. No dramatic finale, no desperate clinging to power, just a slow, deliberate exit. And honestly, in the context of ancient rulers, that's almost suspiciously calm. Now, as Chandragupta fades out of the story, the empire doesn't collapse, which is always a good sign. It passes to his son, Bindusara. Bindusara is a less famous, which usually means he did his job without too much chaos. He maintains the empire, keeps things running, expands a little here and there. Nothing too dramatic. Just steady governance, which, in a story full of extremes, feels like a quiet intermission. But don't get too comfortable, because eventually we arrive at one of the most well-known figures in Indian history. A man who starts off quite intense and then gradually becomes something else entirely. Let's float over to another royal life. This one's slightly more complicated. Bindusara's son, a prince named Ashoka. Now, young Ashoka is not exactly introduced as a gentle soul. He's ambitious, capable, and reportedly a bit ruthless. The kind of prince who doesn't just wait patiently for power. Because royal families across history have a remarkable talent for turning dinner conversations into political crises. Eventually, Ashoka secures the throne. And once he does, he doesn't sit quietly. He expands the empire further, pushes its boundaries, strengthens its hold. And then, inevitably, he turns his attention to a region called Kalinga. Now, we're not going to dwell on the details here, because this is meant to be calm, remember. But let's just say the campaign is not gentle, and something about it changes him. After the conflict, Ashoka experiences a shift, a deep, personal transformation, the kind that makes a powerful ruler stop and reconsider everything, which, historically speaking, doesn't happen very often. He turns toward Buddhism, embraces its teachings, and begins to reshape his rule around ideas of compassion, nonviolence, and moral responsibility. Yes, the same man who expanded an empire through force now starts promoting kindness. Because humans are complicated. Ashoka issues edicts, carved into stone pillars across the empire. Messages about ethical living, religious tolerance, respect for all beings. It's a very different tone from the usual, I conquered this, therefore I am great style of rulership. Instead, it's more like, maybe we should all just be better. And surprisingly, it works. The empire remains stable. The administration continues. And Ashoka's legacy becomes one of transformation rather than domination, which is a rare shift. Now, As we gently pause here, the Maurya Empire stands at its peak, built by Chandragupta's ambition, maintained by Bindusara's steadiness, and reshaped by Ashoka's introspection. 3 rulers, 3 very different approaches, all part of the same story. And like most stories involving power, it won't last forever. But we're not rushing ahead just yet. For now, just sit with it. The slow rise, the quiet decisions, the strange, very human choices that shaped an empire. Hey guys, let's just gently pick up where we left off. No rush, no sudden movements, just a slow drift back into the warm, slightly dusty corridors of the Maurya Empire. By now, you're already familiar with Ashoka, the prince who didn't exactly tiptoe into power, the emperor who expanded his reach with confidence and then, quite unexpectedly, decided to emotionally process his life choices, which, again, is not something most ancient rulers scheduled into their calendars. So here we are. Ashoka is on the throne. The empire is vast. The administration is running. And for a while, things follow the usual pattern. Expansion,
Control. Authority.
the standard checklist of empire building. But then comes that moment, the one that shifts everything slightly off its usual axis. After the Kalinga campaign, Ashoka pauses. Not dramatically, not with some grand speech, just a quiet, internal pause. The kind where a person who is everything suddenly starts wondering if that was actually the goal. And instead of brushing it off, he leans into it. He turns toward Buddhism, not casually, not as a passing interest, but with real commitment. He begins to adopt its principles. Compassion, restraint, a kind of moral awareness that feels almost out of place in a royal court. And suddenly, the emperor, who once expanded his empire through force, is now encouraging people to be kind to each other. It's a bit of a tonal shift. Now, imagine being an official in Ashoka's court during this transition. One day, you're managing taxes and logistics under a very traditional ruler. The next, your emperor is talking about ethical behavior and humane treatment of all beings. You'd probably nod politely while quietly wondering what exactly changed. But Ashoka doesn't just talk about it. He formalizes it. He has his ideas carved into stone. Quite literally. Across the empire, pillars and rock edicts appear. Messages written in simple language. Clear instructions. Encouraging people to live better, treat others with respect, and avoid unnecessary harm. It's almost like an ancient version of public service announcements, but carved into giant rocks. Subtle, but permanent. These edicts don't just focus on religion. They talk about everyday behavior. Respect for parents. Fair treatment of servants. Kindness toward animals. Yes, even animals. Ashoka, it seems, had reached a point where he looked at the world and thought, maybe we could all just relax a little. And honestly, that's not the worst idea. Now, this doesn't mean the empire becomes soft or unstable. Administration continues. Laws are enforced. Trade flows. Roads are maintained. The machinery of the state keeps moving. But there's a noticeable shift in tone. Less emphasis on conquest. More emphasis on governance. Less, let's expand again. More, let's take care of what we already have. Which, for an empire of that size, is probably a smart move. Ashoka also sends out envoys. Not to conquer, but to share ideas. Buddhist teachings spread beyond the empire. To Sri Lanka. To Central Asia. even reaching parts of the Hellenistic world. It's a quiet kind of influence, not forced, just offered, and over time it leaves a mark. Now let's slow down for a moment and just picture Ashoka himself during these later years. He's no longer the ambitious prince, no longer the aggressive conqueror. He's older, more reflective, surrounded by the same palace walls, but seeing them a little differently. Power hasn't disappeared. It's just softened. And that's a rare thing. Of course, not everything is perfectly serene. Running a massive empire still comes with its usual complications. There are always tensions, always challenges, always the quiet hum of things that could go wrong if not managed carefully. But Ashoka maintains control, at least for a while. Because here's the thing about empires, they don't just depend on one person. Even a very thoughtful, introspective emperor can't guarantee what happens after he's gone. And Ashoka's successors, well, they don't quite carry the same presence. After his death, the Maurya Empire begins to loosen. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a slow, gradual fading of central authority. The kind where things don't collapse overnight, they just stop holding together quite as tightly. Provinces become a little more independent. Control becomes a little more difficult. The structure that once felt so solid begins to show small cracks. And without a strong figure to hold it all in place, those cracks widen. It's not anyone's fault, really. Maintaining an empire of that size requires constant attention, constant energy,
Constant something.
and that something is hard to pass down from one ruler to the next. So the Maurya Empire, after reaching such impressive heights, slowly declines. No dramatic ending. No single moment where everything falls apart. Just a quiet unwinding, which, in a way, feels consistent with the tone we've been following. Now, let's gently step back from the Mauryas for a moment.
Take a breath.
Let the dust settle. Because history doesn't stop, it just shifts. And as one great empire fades, another slowly begins to form. Not immediately, not in the same way, but gradually, over time, a new kind of power rises in the Indian subcontinent. Let's float forward a few centuries. The political landscape has changed. The large, unified control of the Mauryas is gone. In its place, smaller kingdoms, regional powers, a more fragmented world, which, interestingly, creates space for new ideas, new leaders, new experiments in governance. And eventually we arrive at the beginning of the Gupta Empire. Now, the Guptas don't burst onto the scene with dramatic conquest. They're quieter, more measured, almost patient. It starts with a man named Sri Gupta. Not much is known about him, which usually means he was laying foundations rather than making headlines. A modest beginning, a small kingdom, the kind that doesn't attract much attention at first. But sometimes those are the ones to watch, because what follows is a slow build, generation by generation, expansion, consolidation, careful alliances, until eventually we reach a ruler who takes things to the next level. Chandragupta I. Yes, another Chandragupta. Different dynasty. Similar name. History does enjoy a bit of repetition. Chandragupta I isn't just a ruler. He's a strategist. He strengthens his position through marriage, forms alliances, expands his influence without rushing into unnecessary conflict. It's all very controlled. very deliberate. And it works. The Gupta Empire begins to take shape, not as a sudden, overwhelming force, but as a steadily growing presence. Which brings us to his son, Samudragupta. Now, Samudragupta is often described as a great conqueror, but let's keep things calm here. Think of him less as a whirlwind of action and more as someone who simply didn't like leaving things unfinished. He campaigns across northern India, expands the empire's reach, establishes dominance, but often allows defeated rulers to continue governing as long as they accept his authority, which is actually quite practical. Why manage everything directly when you can let others handle it for you? It's efficient, low maintenance, very organized. And alongside his military activities, Samudragupta also has a softer side.
He's a patron of the arts,
A supporter of culture, a man who appreciates music and poetry, because of course he does. Nothing says well-rounded ruler like conquering territories by day and enjoying artistic expression by evening. And under his rule, the Gupta Empire grows stronger, more stable, more refined, setting the stage for what many consider a golden age. But we're not rushing there just yet. For now, just let the transition settle in. From the intense rise of the Mauryas to their quiet decline to the gentle emergence of the Guptas. Different rhythms, different personalities. Same underlying story of power, ambition, and the occasional moment of unexpected introspection. Hey guys, let's settle back in again, no need to rush. Just let your mind drift gently back into the slow rhythm of ancient India, where empires rise, fade, and then quietly make room for the next set of very confident rulers. We've just arrived in the Gupta world. Things feel a little different here. Less heavy, less tense. Almost like the empire learned from the past and decided to keep things slightly more elegant. And at the center of this growing, calm but capable system, we find Samudragupta. Now, Samudragupta is one of those rulers who somehow manages to be very busy without seeming chaotic. He expands, organizes, governs, but there's a smoothness to it, a kind of controlled momentum. He inherits the foundation built by his father, Chandragupta I, a stable base, a growing influence, a kingdom that's ready to become something larger. And Samudragupta looks at it and thinks quite calmly, yes, let's expand that. Of course he does. But unlike rulers who charge forward with constant, exhausting intensity, Samudragupta's approach feels measured, strategic, almost like he's carefully selecting which doors to open rather than trying to break them all down at once. He conducts campaigns across northern India, extends his influence into central regions, even moves toward the south. And as he does this, he develops a very practical habit. Instead of directly ruling every territory he encounters, he often allows local kings to remain in power, as long as they acknowledge his authority and, presumably, don't cause problems. It's a clever system. Less administrative stress, less resistance, more control without the constant effort. You can almost imagine him thinking, why micromanage when I can just supervise? And honestly, it works beautifully. The empire grows, but it doesn't become overstretched. It expands, but maintains a kind of balance. Now, what makes Samudragupta particularly interesting is that he isn't just focused on power. He has hobbies.
Yes,
An emperor with hobbies. He's known for his appreciation of music, often depicted playing a veena, writing poetry, engaging with the arts. So while he's out there expanding an empire, he's also taking time to express himself creatively, which creates a slightly amusing image. A ruler who can conquer a region and then sit down later and compose something reflective about it. Because why not add a little artistic flair to imperial expansion? It's this combination that gives the Gupta period its distinct tone. Strength without harshness. Power without constant aggression. A sense that things are under control. Now, as Samudragupta's reign continues, the empire becomes more than just a political entity. It turns into a cultural center. Trade flourishes. Ideas move freely. Scholars find support. Art and literature begin to thrive. It's not loud, not overwhelming, just a steady blooming. And through it all, Samudragupta maintains his position. Not by force alone, but through a careful balance of authority and flexibility, which, again, is not the usual approach for ancient rulers. Eventually, like all emperors, his time comes to a close. Not abruptly, just naturally. And what he leaves behind is something stable, something ready to continue growing, which brings us, very gently, to the next figure, his son, Chandragupta II. Yes, another Chandragupta. History really does enjoy repeating names just to keep things slightly confusing. But Chandragupta II, often known as Vikramaditya, brings his own style to the throne. If Samudragupta was the calm expansionist, Chandragupta II is the refined consolidator. He inherits a strong empire, a well-organized system, a cultural environment that's already beginning to flourish. And instead of dramatically changing course, he leans into it. He strengthens what already exists, which, in many ways, is the mark of a confident ruler. There's no need to prove anything. No need for constant conquest. Just careful maintenance and a few strategic improvements. Of course, he does expand the empire further, especially toward Western India, securing important trade routes, strengthening economic connections. Because even in a calm, cultured empire, trade still matters, probably more than ever. Under Chandragupta II, the Gupta Empire reaches what many consider its golden age. And you can almost feel the difference. There's a sense of ease, a quiet prosperity, cities growing, markets active, scholars writing, artists creating. It's not perfect, of course. No era ever is. But compared to the constant rise and fall tension of earlier times, this feels stable, comfortable. Now, let's slow down and take a moment to look at daily life during this period. Imagine walking through a Gupta city. The streets are active, but not chaotic. Trade is happening. Goods moving from one place to another. There's a rhythm to it. People are working, but not under constant pressure of upheaval. There's space for thought, for learning, for it just existing. And in the background, the empire holds everything together. Quietly, efficiently, which is exactly what a well-functioning system is supposed to do. Now, Chandragupta II is also known for supporting scholars and intellectuals. This is the period often associated with figures like Kalidasa, a poet and playwright whose work becomes widely celebrated. So while the empire is running smoothly, there's also this flourishing of ideas, literature, science, philosophy. It's a moment where power and creativity coexist. And surprisingly, they don't get in each other's way. Of course, like all golden ages, this one doesn't feel dramatic while it's happening. People living in it probably didn't wake up each morning thinking, yes, another day in a golden age. They were just living, working, thinking, creating, occasionally dealing with the usual human complications. But looking back, it stands out. Now, as Chandragupta II continues his reign, the empire remains stable,
Strong.
well managed. But there's always that quiet question in the background. How long can this last? Because history has a way of slowly shifting. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a gradual change in momentum. And as we move forward, we begin to see small signs. Nothing alarming, just subtle adjustments, slight changes in control, a few pressures building at the edges. The kind of things that don't seem important at first, but eventually start to matter. But we're not there yet. For now, just stay here a little longer. In this calm, balanced moment, where rulers are competent, systems are working, and an empire is quietly enjoying the results of careful planning and steady leadership. Hey guys, let's ease back in, no rush, just a slow drift into the later days of the Gupta Empire. The lights are still soft, the city's still busy, and everything still feels mostly fine. Which, as history likes to remind us, is often the exact moment when things begin to very gently not be fine. But we're not jumping ahead. Let's stay calm. We left off with Chandragupta II, confident, composed, and quietly presiding over what many later historians would call a golden age. Trade is flowing. Culture is thriving. Scholars are writing things that future students will pretend to fully understand. And the empire is comfortable. Now, Chandragupta II doesn't radically change the system he inherited. He refines it, strengthens trade networks, especially toward the western coast, keeps relationships stable, maintains internal order. It's all very competent, which, interestingly, makes his reign feel almost invisible in terms of drama.
And that's not a bad thing.
In fact, it's probably ideal, because when an empire runs smoothly, there isn't much to complain about. No sudden chaos, no constant crisis, just a steady rhythm of governance. But even in this calm, small shifts begin. Nothing alarming, just subtle. As Chandragupta II grows older, the usual question quietly approaches. Who comes next? Now, succession in royal families is rarely as simple as the next person just takes over and everyone agrees. There are always layers, expectations, quiet tensions, possibly a few relatives who suddenly become very interested in politics. Because of course they do. Eventually, the throne passes to his son, Kumaragupta I. And Kumaragupta steps into a very comfortable position. A stable empire, strong foundations, a legacy of capable rulers behind him, which is both a gift and a challenge, because maintaining something successful can be harder than building it. There's less room for bold moves, more pressure to avoid mistakes, and a constant, quiet expectation to not mess this up. Kumaragupta, to his credit, does fairly well. He keeps the system running, maintains stability, continues supporting religious and cultural institutions. There's no sudden collapse, no dramatic decline, just continuity, which, again, is exactly what you want. But somewhere during his reign, we start to notice faint disturbances at the edges of the empire. external pressures, groups moving, testing boundaries. Looking at this well-organized, prosperous empire and thinking. Interesting. Among these are the Hunas, a group whose movements across regions begin to create slow, persistent pressure. Not an immediate crisis, just a presence. Like a distant storm that hasn't quite arrived yet, but you can see the clouds forming. Now, Kumaragupta doesn't panic. The empire is still strong, still capable, still very much in control. But the tone shifts slightly. It's no longer just about maintaining prosperity. It's about preparing for potential strain. And that's a different kind of energy. Still calm, but a little more alert. Eventually, Kumaragupta's reign comes to an end. Again, not with drama. Just the natural passing of time. And the throne moves to Skandagupta. Now, Skandagupta is where things start to feel a bit heavier. Not chaotic. Not collapsing. Just heavier. Because he inherits not just an empire, but the beginnings of real pressure. The Hunas are no longer just a distant concern. They're closer, more active, testing the empire's strength in a more direct way. And Skandagupta responds. He defends the empire, pushes back, maintains control. But defense is different from expansion. It requires constant attention, constant effort, a different kind of focus. And over time, that effort begins to show. The empire holds, but the cost is there. Resources are stretched a little thinner. Energy is spent maintaining boundaries rather than expanding them. And while everything is still functioning, it's no longer effortless, which is often the first real sign of change. Now let's slow down here, because this isn't a dramatic fall. Not at all. The Gupta Empire doesn't suddenly collapse into chaos. Cities don't empty overnight. Systems don't disappear. Instead, things become less certain. Authority becomes slightly more localized. Control slightly less centralized. Provinces begin to operate with a bit more independence. Nothing extreme, just gradual loosening. And in some ways, this is very human. After generations of strong leadership, the system begins to rely less on a central figure and more on local structures, which can work for a while. But it also changes the nature of the empire. It becomes less of a unified whole and more of a collection of parts. Still connected, still recognizable, but not quite as tightly bound. Now imagine being someone living during this time. You might not notice anything dramatic. Your daily life continues. Markets open. Goods are traded. People go about their routines. But there's a subtle difference. A slight uncertainty in the background. The kind you can't quite name but can feel. And that's how large changes often begin. Quietly. Now, as Skandagupta's reign progresses, the pressure continues. Not overwhelming, just persistent. And after him, the line of rulers becomes a less clear, less strong, more fragmented. The kind of succession that doesn't inspire confidence, but also doesn't immediately cause collapse. No dramatic decline, just continuity, which, again, is exactly what you want. But somewhere during his reign, we start to notice faint disturbances at the edges of the empire. External pressures, groups moving, testing boundaries. Looking at this well-organized, prosperous empire and thinking. Interesting. Among these are the Hunas, a group whose movements across regions begin to create slow, persistent pressure. Not an immediate crisis, just a presence, like a distant storm that hasn't quite arrived yet, but you can see the clouds forming. Now, Kumaragupta doesn't panic. The empire is still strong, still capable, still very much in control. But the tone shifts slightly. It's no longer just about maintaining prosperity. It's about preparing for potential strain. And that's a different kind of energy. Still calm, but a little more alert. Eventually, Kumaragupta's reign comes to an end. Again, not with drama, just the natural passing of time. And the throne moves to Skandagupta. Now, Skandagupta is where things start to feel a bit heavier. Not chaotic, not collapsing, just heavier. Because he inherits not just an empire, but the beginnings of real pressure. The Hunas are no longer just a distant concern. They're closer, more active, testing the empire's strength in a more direct way. And Skandagupta responds. He defends the empire, pushes back, maintains control. But defense is different from expansion. It requires constant attention, constant effort, a different kind of focus. And over time, that effort begins to show. The empire holds, but the cost is there. Resources are stretched a little thinner. Energy is spent maintaining boundaries rather than expanding them. And while everything is still functioning, it's no longer effortless, which is often the first real sign of change. Now, let's slow down here, because this isn't a dramatic fall. Not at all. The Gupta Empire doesn't suddenly collapse into chaos. Cities don't empty overnight. Systems don't disappear. Instead, things become less certain. Authority becomes slightly more localized. Control slightly less centralized. Provinces begin to operate with a bit more independence. Nothing extreme, just gradual loosening. And in some ways, this is very human. After generations of strong leadership, the system begins to rely less on a central figure and more on local structures, which can work for a while. But it also changes the nature of the empire. It becomes less of a unified whole and more of a collection of parts. Still connected, still recognizable, but not quite as tightly bound. Now, imagine being someone living during this time. You might not notice anything dramatic. Your daily life continues. Markets open. Goods are traded. People go about their routines. But there's a subtle difference. A slight uncertainty in the background. The kind you can't quite name but can feel. And that's how large changes often begin. Quietly. Now, as Skandagupta's reign progresses, the pressure continues. Not overwhelming, just persistent. And after him, the line of rulers becomes a less clear, less strong, more fragmented. The kind of succession that doesn't inspire confidence, but also doesn't immediately cause collapse. Just a gradual weakening of central authority. And over time, the Gupta Empire begins to fade. Not disappear completely, just lose its shape. Its influence becomes more regional, its control more limited, its presence less dominant, until eventually, what was once a vast, unified empire becomes a memory, a reference point, a period people look back on and say, that was a good time. Which is, in many ways, the quietest ending an empire can have. No final dramatic moment, just a slow, steady drift into history. Now let's take a breath, because we've just moved through something interesting. The rise of the Mauryas. ambition, structure, transformation. The calm strength of the Guptas. Culture, stability, refinement. And then the gentle shift. The slow loosening. The natural fading that comes when systems outlive the people who built them. No sudden chaos. No explosive ending. Just time doing what it always does. And as we sit here, in this calm after the story, it's worth noticing something. All of these rulers, Chandragupta Maurya, Ashoka, Samudragupta, Chandragupta too, they weren't just building empires. They were navigating something much more personal. Power, responsibility,
Change.
letting go. Sometimes they handled it well, sometimes less so. But in the end, they all moved through the same quiet cycle.
Rise.
Hold, reflect.
Fade.
And honestly, that rhythm feels strangely familiar. No dramatic decline, just continuity, which, again, is exactly what you want. But somewhere during his reign, we start to notice faint disturbances at the edges of the empire. External pressures, groups moving, testing boundaries. Looking at this well-organized, prosperous empire and thinking, interesting. Among these are the Hunas, a group whose movements across regions begin to create slow, persistent pressure. Not an immediate crisis, just a presence, like a distant storm that hasn't quite arrived yet, but you can see the clouds forming. Now, Kumaragupta doesn't panic. The empire is still strong, still capable, still very much in control. But the tone shifts slightly. It's no longer just about maintaining prosperity. It's about preparing for potential strain. And that's a different kind of energy. Still calm, but a little more alert. Eventually, Kumaragupta's reign comes to an end. Again, not with drama, just the natural passing of time. And the throne moves to Skandagupta. Now, Skandagupta is where things start to feel a bit heavier. Not chaotic, not collapsing, just heavier. Because he inherits not just an empire, but the beginnings of real pressure. The Hunas are no longer just a distant concern. They're closer, more active, testing the empire's strength in a more direct way. And Skandagupta responds. He defends the empire, pushes back, maintains control. But defense is different from expansion. It requires constant attention, constant effort, a different kind of focus. And over time, that effort begins to show. The empire holds, but the cost is there. Resources are stretched a little thinner. Energy is spent maintaining boundaries rather than expanding them. And while everything is still functioning, it's no longer effortless, which is often the first real sign of change. Now, let's slow down here, because this isn't a dramatic fall. Not at all. The Gupta Empire doesn't suddenly collapse into chaos. Cities don't empty overnight. Systems don't disappear. Instead, things become less certain. Authority becomes slightly more localized. Control slightly less centralized. Provinces begin to operate with a bit more independence. Nothing extreme, just gradual loosening. And in some ways, this is very human. After generations of strong leadership, the system begins to rely less on a central figure and more on local structures, which can work for a while. But it also changes the nature of the empire. It becomes less of a unified whole and more of a collection of parts. Still connected, still recognizable, but not quite as tightly bound. Now, Imagine being someone living during this time. You might not notice anything dramatic. Your daily life continues. Markets open. Goods are traded. People go about their routines. But there's a subtle difference. A slight uncertainty in the background. The kind you can't quite name but can feel. And that's how large changes often begin. Quietly. Now, as Skandagupta's reign progresses, the pressure continues. Not overwhelming, just persistent. And after him, the line of rulers becomes a less clear, less strong, more fragmented. The kind of succession that doesn't inspire confidence, but also doesn't immediately cause collapse. Just a gradual weakening of central authority. And over time, the Gupta Empire begins to fade. Not disappear completely, just lose its shape. Its influence becomes more regional, its control more limited, its presence less dominant, until eventually, what was once a vast, unified empire becomes a memory, a reference point, a period people look back on and say, that was a good time. Which is, in many ways, the quietest ending an empire can have. No final dramatic moment, just a slow, steady drift into history. Now let's take a breath, because we've just moved through something interesting. The rise of the Mauryas. Ambition, structure, transformation. The calm strength of the Guptas. Culture, stability, refinement. And then the gentle shift, the slow loosening, the natural fading that comes when systems outlive the people who built them. No sudden chaos, no explosive ending, just time doing what it always does. And as we sit here, in this calm after the story, it's worth noticing something. All of these rulers, Chandragupta Maurya, Ashoka, Samudragupta, Chandragupta too, they weren't just building empires. They were navigating something much more personal. Power, responsibility,
Change.
letting go. Sometimes they handled it well, sometimes less so. But in the end, they all moved through the same quiet cycle.
Rise.
Hold, reflect.
Fade.
And honestly, that rhythm feels strangely familiar. Hey guys, let's drift back in one more time, nice and slow, like you're walking through the quiet ruins of something that used to be very important and now just kind of exists. No urgency, no pressure, just a soft continuation. By now, the Maurya and Gupta empires have both done what empires tend to do. They rose, they expanded, they stabilized, and then very politely stepped out of the spotlight. No dramatic curtain call, just a gradual fading. But here's the thing about empires, even when they're gone, they don't really leave. They linger. In habits, in systems, in ideas that quietly stick around long after the people who created them have disappeared into footnotes. So, let's just sit with that for a moment. Imagine the Indian subcontinent after the Guptas. There's no single, overwhelming power controlling everything. Instead, there are regional kingdoms, smaller rulers, local centers of authority. It's more scattered, but not chaotic, because underneath it all, there's still structure, still memory, still a sense of how things are supposed to work. That doesn't just vanish. Take administration, for example. The Mauryas had built this highly organized, centralized system. Officials for everything. Layers of governance. A kind of bureaucratic rhythm that made a massive empire function. And even after they're gone, that idea remains. Future rulers don't start from scratch. They borrow,
Adapt.
reuse, because Once you've seen a system that works, you don't just forget it. Same with the Guptas. Their approach is softer, less centralized, more flexible, allowing regions to maintain a bit of independence while still being part of a larger structure. And that idea also sticks. So what you get in the centuries that follow is this quiet blending of approaches. Some rulers lean towards strong central control. Others prefer a lighter touch. It's less about inventing something new and more about choosing which version of the past feels most useful. Now, let's gently shift toward culture, because this is where things get quietly impressive. During the Gupta period especially, there's a flourishing of art, literature, and knowledge. And unlike political power, which fades, culture tends to be a bit more stubborn. It stays. Texts continue to be read. Ideas continue to circulate. Art styles influence future creations. Scholars keep building on what came before. It's like a slow, ongoing conversation across generations. No rush. No clear endpoint. Just people thinking, writing, creating, and occasionally disagreeing in very polite, intellectual ways. Now imagine a student, a few centuries later, sitting somewhere in a small learning center, reading texts that were written during the Gupta era. To them, it's not ancient history. It's just knowledge. Something to learn. Something to question.
Something to pass on.
And that's how influence works. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just continuously. Now, let's talk about religion for a moment.
Gently.
Because during these empires, especially under Ashoka, there's a strong emphasis on ethical living, on ideas of compassion, nonviolence, and tolerance. And while rulers come and go, those ideas don't just disappear. They move. They shift. They adapt to new contexts, new rulers, new communities. But the core remains. And over time, they become part of the broader cultural landscape, not tied to one empire, not dependent on one ruler, just present. Now, here's something quietly interesting. When we look back at these empires today, we often focus on their size, their power, their rulers. But the people living at the time probably didn't experience it that way. For them, it was daily life.
Markets.
Conversations.
Work.
Family. Small routines. The empire was just the background. Something that shaped their world, but didn't define every moment of it. And that's easy to forget, because history tends to zoom in on the big figures, the emperors, the decisions, the shifts in power. But underneath all of that, there were millions of ordinary lives. Quiet,
Steady.
unrecorded, and in many ways, they're the ones who carried the legacy forward by continuing traditions, passing on knowledge, keeping systems alive in small, everyday ways. Not dramatic, just consistent. Now, let's float a little further into the long-term picture. Centuries pass. New rulers emerge. New empires form. Different names. Different styles. Different ambitions. But if you look closely, you can still see the echoes. Administrative ideas that feel familiar. Cultural patterns that trace back to earlier periods. Philosophical concepts that have been gently evolving for generations. It's all still there, just layered. Now let's pause again, because there's something oddly calming about this part of the story. No sudden rise, no dramatic fall, just continuity. A quiet sense that even as things change, something deeper stays the same. And maybe that's the most lasting part of these empires. Not the territory, not the power,
But the patterns they set.
the ways of thinking, the approaches to governance, the cultural expressions. All of it gently shaping what comes next. Now, as we come toward the end of this slow journey, let's not rush to conclusions. Just sit with the rhythm we've followed. Chandragupta Maurya starting from uncertainty and building something vast. Ashoka stepping back and asking deeper questions. The Guptas creating a space where culture and stability could quietly thrive. And then the gradual shift, the soft fading. They transition into something new. No sharp edges. No loud endings. Just time moving forward. And if there's one thing these stories seem to suggest, it's this. Power is temporary. Structure evolves. But ideas tend to linger. They drift through generations. Change shape.
Adapt. Continue.
Much like the story itself.
Slow. Steady.
And still going, even after the empires are gone. So for now, just let that settle. No need to overthink it. Just a quiet ending to a very long, very human story. Hey guys, let's ease back in one last time. Nothing new to chase. Nowhere urgent to go. Just a soft return to the afterglow of everything we've already wandered through. By now, the Maurya and Gupta empires are long gone. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. More like an old conversation that slowly trailed off until one day, no one was quite sure when it ended. And yet, if you listen carefully, it never really did. Because empires, for all their structure and ambition, don't actually control what lasts. They build roads, systems, cities, ideas, and then people keep using them, quietly,
Casually.
without thinking too much about where they came from. So, let's just drift through that for a moment. Imagine a road stretching across northern India, well-worn, familiar, used by traders, travelers, messengers. It existed during the Maurya period, maintained, improved, extended. Now, centuries later, someone is still walking along it. They're not thinking about Chandragupta Maurya. They're just going somewhere. And that's how legacy works. Not as a monument, but as a habit. Now, let's gently shift to something softer. Language. During the Gupta period, Sanskrit becomes a refined and widely used medium for literature, scholarship, and official communication. Texts are written, poems composed, ideas carefully shaped into words. And those words don't disappear. They're copied, studied, repeated. A teacher explains a verse. A student memorizes it. Another teacher passes it on. No urgency. No rush, just a slow, steady continuity. And over time, it becomes part of the intellectual fabric of the region, not tied to one empire, just present. Now, imagine a quiet learning space. Maybe not grand. Maybe just a shaded area where a few students sit with a teacher. They're discussing ideas, philosophy, ethics, mathematics. Some of those ideas trace back to the Gupta era. Others go even further. And no one pauses to say, this came from a specific ruler at a specific time. Because by now, it doesn't matter. The idea has outlived the context, which is, in a way, the most peaceful kind of survival. Now, let's drift slightly toward daily life again. Because while we've spent a lot of time with emperors, most people never met one. They lived in villages,
Towns.
small communities. They farmed, traded, raised families, argued over very ordinary things. And through all the rise and fall of empires, that part stayed surprisingly consistent. The rulers changed, the boundaries shifted, but the rhythm of everyday life continued. And in that quiet consistency, the deeper legacy of these empires found a place to settle. Not in grand declarations, but in routines, in the way land was managed, in the way trade was organized, in the way communities understood authority and responsibility, all shaped, in small ways, by what came before. Now, here's something gently ironic. The emperors we've talked about, Chandragupta Maurya, Ashoka, Samudragupta, Chandragupta II, they spent their lives building, expanding, refining, carefully shaping something they hoped would last. And in a sense, it did, just not in the way they might have imagined. The empires themselves didn't remain intact, but the patterns did. The ideas did. The quiet habits of governance, culture, and thought, those continued, which makes their legacy feel less like a solid structure and more like a ripple,
spreading outward,
fading slightly but never fully disappearing. Now let's slow down even more, because we're reaching that point where the story doesn't really end. It just settles. There's no final ruler to introduce. No last decision that wraps everything up neatly. Just a gradual transition into the long flow of history, where new stories begin, new empires rise, and the old ones become part of the background. Still there, just not in focus anymore. And if you look closely at those future empires, you'll see familiar shapes, approaches to governance that echo the Mauryas, cultural richness that reflects the Guptas, philosophical ideas that trace back through centuries of quiet development, all layered together, all continuing. Now let's take one final breath here, because what we've just moved through isn't a story about sudden events.
It's a story about time.
Slow, patient, almost unnoticeable time. The kind that builds empires and then gently takes them apart. Not out of cruelty, just because that's what time does. And in the middle of it all, people continue. Thinking, creating, adapting, carrying forward pieces of the past without even realizing it. So as we come to this quiet close, there's no big conclusion waiting. Just a soft understanding that the rise of ancient India through the Maurya and Gupta empires wasn't just about power. It was about continuity, about how ideas move, how systems evolve, how even the most powerful structures eventually become part of something larger, something slower, something ongoing. And maybe that's the calmest thought to end on. Nothing really disappears. It just changes form.
So for now, just let that sit. No need to hold on to it.
No need to analyze it. Just a quiet story, drifting gently into the background, where it will probably stay a little longer than expected. Hey guys, let's settle in again. No effort. No thinking too hard, just a slow, quiet drift through what's left of the story. At this point, we're not really following emperors anymore. No one is stepping onto a throne. No one is making bold declarations. No one is looking at a map and thinking, yes, I'll take all of this. That phase has passed. What we're left with now is something softer, a kind of historical aftertaste. The part where everything that once felt solid becomes slightly blurred. And strangely, this is where things feel the most real. Because this is where history stops being about rulers and starts being about people. Let's imagine a small town somewhere in the Indian subcontinent. Not particularly famous. Not recorded in great detail. Just there. The kind of place that never shows up in grand narratives. People wake up early. Go about their work, maybe farming, maybe trading, maybe crafting something small and useful. And in the background, there are systems, ways of organizing land, methods of collecting taxes, traditions of governance. None of it feels new. None of it feels revolutionary. It just feels normal. But if you trace those systems back, slowly, patiently, you'd start to see familiar patterns. A little Maurya here, a little Gupta there, layered together so seamlessly that no one even notices anymore. And that's the quiet power of what came before. Not in being remembered, but in being absorbed. Now let's drift slightly further. Imagine a teacher sitting with a small group of students under a tree. No grand institution, no formal structure, just a shared space for learning. They're discussing ideas, ethics, maybe a bit of philosophy. And the ideas they're talking about, they didn't appear out of nowhere. They've been shaped over time, passed down, refined. Some of them might echo the moral focus that grew during Ashoka's time. Others might reflect the intellectual flowering of the Gupta period. But no one says that out loud, because by now, those ideas don't belong to a single moment. They belong to everyone. And that's when history becomes something else. Not a timeline, not a list of events, but a kind of quiet inheritance. Now, here's where things get gently ironic again. The rulers we spent time with, they probably cared a lot about being remembered. Their achievements, their power, their place in history. And yes, they are remembered. Their names still come up. Their stories still get told. But the deeper impact they had isn't in those names. It's in the parts that no one attributes to them anymore. The systems that feel normal. The ideas that feel obvious. The patterns that feel like they've always been there. That's where they lasted, which is a very calm, very quiet kind of success. Now, let's not rush past this part, because this is where the story slows down the most. There are no turning points here. No major events to highlight. Just continuity. The kind that doesn't demand attention. The kind that simply exists. And in a way, that's what makes it feel so complete. Because everything that needed to happen already has. The rise. The expansion. The reflection. The gradual fading. And now, the settling. Now, if we zoom out just a little, we can see something even more interesting. The Maurya and Gupta empires weren't isolated stories. They were part of a much longer flow. Before them, there were other cultures, other systems, other ways of organizing life. After them, more would come. Different rulers, different empires, different approaches. But none of it starts from zero. Everything builds on what came before. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes without even realizing it. And that's the thread that connects all of this. Not power, not territory, but continuity. Now let's gently return to something simple. A person, just one person, living their life somewhere in this long stretch of time. They don't know they're part of history. They're not thinking about empires. They're just living, making choices, solving small problems, enjoying small moments. And yet, their life is shaped by everything we've talked about. The systems around them, the ideas they've inherited, the culture they're part of, all quietly influenced by people who lived centuries before, people they've never heard of. And that's the final, quiet connection, the one that doesn't need explanation. Now, as we come to the very end of this slow journey, there's nothing left to build, nothing left to expand, just a gentle awareness of how everything fits together. The Mauryas building structure from ambition, the Guptas refining it into something stable and creative, and then time doing its quiet work, not destroying, just reshaping, and leaving behind something softer, something less visible, but still very much there. So, as the story settles, there's no need for a final statement. No grand conclusion.
Just this.
Everything we've walked through is still, in some way, ongoing. Not as empires, but as influence, as patterns, as quiet echoes that continue to move forward one small, unremarkable moment at a time. And that's probably the calmest way for any story to end. Not with a full stop, but with a slow, gentle continuation. Hey guys, let's ease in one final time. No need to sit up. No need to focus too hard. Just let this be the part where everything slows down enough to almost disappear. We've followed emperors. Ambitious ones. Thoughtful ones. Slightly intense ones who probably needed a nap, but chose conquest instead. We've watched systems form, expand, stabilize, and then very politely loosen their grip. And now we're here, at the point where history stops trying to impress you. No more grand narratives. No more this changed everything moments. Just a quiet, steady presence like a story that's already been told, but still lingers in the room. Now, if we gently look back, not too sharply, just a soft glance, it all begins to feel less like separate events and more like a single, slow movement. Chandragupta Maurya, starting from almost nothing, building something enormous, mostly because someone told him it was possible and he didn't immediately say no. Ashoka, realizing, midway through being extremely powerful, that maybe power isn't the only thing worth having, and deciding to emotionally recalibrate an entire empire. The Guptas, stepping in later, looking at everything and thinking, let's keep the good parts and maybe make things a little more comfortable. And then time, just time, which doesn't argue, doesn't rush, doesn't explain itself. It just moves. And as it does, everything softens. Structures become traditions. Decisions become habits. Names become slightly familiar sounds that people recognize but don't always fully place. And that's where we are now. Now, let's imagine something very simple. A marketplace. Not a grand one. Not famous. Just a regular place where people gather. Goods are exchanged. Conversations happen in low, steady tones. There's no sign that says this exists because of the Maurya administrative system. No plaque that reads, influenced by Gupta economic stability. And yet both are there. In the organization, in the expectations, in the quiet understanding of how things work.
No one thinks about it.
They just participate. And that's the final stage of influence, when it becomes invisible. Now, let's drift slightly further into something even quieter. Memory. Not recorded history. Not written texts. Just memory as it exists in people. Stories passed down. Not perfectly. Not with full accuracy. Just enough to carry a feeling. Maybe someone mentions a wise king from long ago. Maybe a teacher refers to an old idea without naming its origin. Fragments. Soft, incomplete, but still present. And over time, even those fragments begin to fade. Not disappear completely. Just blend into everything else. Now here's the part that feels almost a little poetic without trying too hard. The people who built these empires probably imagined permanence, strong walls, lasting systems, a legacy that would stand clearly, firmly, for generations. And, in a way, they were right, but not in the way they expected, because what lasted wasn't the structure. It was the imprint, the subtle shaping of how things would be done, how people would think, how societies would organize themselves long after the original framework had dissolved. And that kind of legacy doesn't need recognition. It doesn't need to be remembered clearly. It just needs to continue. Now let's slow everything down even more, because we're at the point where even the story itself is starting to fade into the same quiet pattern. No sharp ending. No final dramatic note, just a gradual settling, like watching the last light of the day slowly disappear without ever quite noticing the exact moment it became night. And maybe that's the most fitting way to leave this. Not with a conclusion, but with a feeling, a soft awareness that everything we've talked about, all the rulers, all the systems, all the changes, they're still here, not as empires, not as power, but as part of the background, the quiet structure beneath everyday life, the unspoken rules, the familiar patterns, the things that feel like they've always been there even though they haven't. And as you sit with that, there's nothing you need to do with it. No lesson to take away. No insight to hold on to. Just let it drift. Let the story dissolve the same way the empires did. Slowly, gently, without resistance, until it becomes just another quiet layer in the long, ongoing rhythm of history. And that's it. Not an ending, just a pause that feels like one. Hey guys, let's just settle in again, softer this time, like we're not really trying to continue a story anymore, just listening to what's left of it. Because at this point, there's nothing new to build. No empire to rise. No ruler to introduce. No turning point waiting around the corner like it's late for an appointment. We're in the space after all of that. The part where even the idea of big history starts to feel a little far away. So let's just stay here, quietly. Now, imagine the same landscape we've been drifting through this whole time. The rivers are still there. The cities still exist in some form. Roads still cut across the land like old memories that refuse to be fully erased. But nobody calls them Mauryan roads anymore. Nobody says this is Gupta-era planning. They're just roads, used because they work. And that's the final transformation of anything built to last. It stops being special and becomes normal. Now, let's drift into something even smaller. A conversation. Two people sitting somewhere talking about life, work, family, weather, the usual rhythm of human existence. One of them mentions an old saying, something about kings or wisdom or balance. They don't know exactly where it came from. They don't need to. It just fits. And that's how ancient systems survive their own endings. Not through preservation, but through casual reuse. Now, let's go even quieter. Imagine a child learning something simple. A number, a word, a story. They're not learning history. They're just learning. But what they're absorbing carries echoes of centuries. Methods of teaching refined over time. Language shaped by generations. Ideas filtered down through countless hands. And none of it feels old. It just feels like how things are done. Now, here's something gently strange to think about. Everything we've talked about, the rise of Maurya power, the calm intelligence of Ashoka, the cultural flowering of the Gupta age, none of it exists in a living, active form anymore. But also, none of it is gone. It's like a background hum, not noticeable on its own, but essential to the shape of everything that follows. Now, let's slow down even further. because we're approaching the point where even language starts to soften, where words stop pointing to specific events and just float. So instead of trying to explain anything new, let's just sit with what already is. Movement.
Change. Continuity.
That's it. Everything else is detail, and details eventually blur. Now imagine time itself, not as a line, but as a slow river. Emperors appear like brief ripples. Empires form like wider currents. And then everything flows onward, mixing, separating, blending again. No single moment stays in place for long, but the movement continues. Always. Now, let's come to the softest point in the story. The realization that there was never really a start or end to any of this in the way we usually imagine. The Mauryas didn't begin history. The Guptas didn't complete it. They were simply phases, patterns in a much longer unfolding. And what we call ancient history is just the part where the patterns are easier to see, because they're bigger, clearer, more defined. Over time, everything becomes subtler, less named, less separated. Now, let's drift one final step inward, to the idea that even now, centuries later, the same kind of processes are still happening. Systems forming, structures changing, ideas moving quietly from one generation to the next, just in different shapes, different names, different speeds, but the same underlying rhythm. And maybe that's the only real conclusion this kind of story ever offers, that nothing really stops. It only transforms. And sometimes it transforms so smoothly that no one notices it happening at all. So we'll end here, not with an ending, not with closure, just a gentle fading of attention, like the story is still there, but you've stopped needing to listen for it, and it continues anyway. Hey guys, yeah, we're still here. Not because something new happened, but because nothing really needs to anymore. This is that final stretch where the story doesn't move forward so much as it just breathes. Slowly, evenly, like it's finally stopped trying to impress anyone. So, let's just stay with it a little longer. No urgency, no direction, just that soft, drifting feeling of everything we've already walked through gently folding back into itself. Now imagine the world we've been talking about. Ancient India after the great empires have already done their thing. There's no central figure anymore casting a huge shadow over everything. No Chandragupta building something from scratch. No Ashoka quietly rewriting what power means. No Gupta rulers polishing stability into something almost elegant. Just regions, cities, people, and a lot of continuity pretending to be normal life, which honestly it usually is. Now, let's zoom in again. Not on kings, not on wars, not on grand systems, just a person, a farmer, a trader, a student, someone ordinary enough that history would never bother writing their name down. They wake up, they work, they talk to people they know, they solve small problems that matter a lot in the moment and almost none in the long view. And yet, their life is built on layers of everything that came before. Land systems shaped by old administrations. Trade habits refined over centuries. Cultural ideas that drifted down from ages when empires were still trying very hard to matter. And they don't think about any of that. Because they don't need to. That's the interesting part. The most powerful things in history eventually become invisible, not because they disappear, but because they succeed too well at becoming normal. Now, let's drift a little further outward. Picture a traveler moving through different towns. Nothing special, just movement from place to place. But everywhere they go, there's a strange familiarity. Similar ways of organizing space. Similar patterns of trade. Similar assumptions about how authority works. Different rulers, maybe. Different names on documents. But the underlying structure feels consistent. And that consistency is the real inheritance of everything we've talked about. Not the empires themselves, but the shared logic they left behind. Now here's where things get gently ironic again. The people who lived through the rise and fall of empires probably didn't think of it as rise and fall. To them, it was just life continuing with occasional adjustments. A new tax here, a new ruler there, a slightly different boundary, but still breakfast in the morning, still work in the day, still stories at night. History, as we describe it later, is always more dramatic than it feels while it's happening. Now, let's slow down even more, because we're getting close to the softest idea in all of this. That even change isn't really something that arrives suddenly. It accumulates, quietly, almost politely, until one day you look around and realize the world is different, but you can't point to the exact moment it changed. That's how empires fade. That's how systems evolve. That's how everything actually works when you're not zoomed in too closely. Now, let's just sit with that for a moment. No explanation layered on top. No extra meaning forced into it. Just the idea that everything is always in motion, even when it feels still. And now, as we come to the very edge of this entire journey, there's nothing left to resolve. Because resolution implies something was incomplete. But this was never incomplete. It was always just unfolding. From the Mauryas building order out of ambition, to Ashoka rethinking what order is even for, to the Guptas turning stability into a kind of cultural calm, to everything afterwards slowly absorbing those ideas until they stopped feeling like history and started feeling like normal life. And then beyond that, just time continuing to do what it does.
Softly.
Relentlessly, without announcement. So we'll end here, not with a conclusion, not with a final statement trying to wrap everything up neatly. Just this. Everything continues. Even this story. It just stops needing to be told out loud. And that's the quietest ending there is.